Mars minus BISHA by Leigh Brackett. Originally published in the January 1954 issue of Planet Stories magazine. In 1967, it was included in a collection of the author's stories entitled The Coming of the Terrans. From 1969 through 1990, it appeared in multiple international science fiction magazines, and from 2008 onwards, it's been in multiple collections from varying publishers. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Mars minus BISHA. It was close on midnight. Both moons were out of the sky, and there was only blackness below and the mighty blaze of stars above, and between them the old wind dragging its feet in the dust. The Quonset stood by itself, a half-mile or so from the canal bank and the town that was on it. Fraser looked at it, thinking what an alien intrusion both it and he were in this place, and wondering if he could stick out the 4.5 months still required of him. The town slept. There was no help for him there. An official order had been given, and so he was tolerated, but he was not welcome. Except in the big trading cities, Earthmen were unwelcome almost anywhere on Mars. It was a lonesome deal. Fraser began to walk again. He walked a lot at night. The days were ugly and depressing, and he spent them inside, working. But the nights were glorious. Not even the driest desert of Earth could produce a sky like this, where the thin air hardly dimmed the luster of the stars. It was the one thing he would miss when he went home. He walked, dressed warmly against the bitter chill. He brooded, and he watched the stars. He thought about his diminishing whiskey supply and the 146 centuries of written history gone into the dust that blew and tortured his sinuses, and after a while he saw the shadow, the dark shape that moved against the wind, silent, purposeful, and swift. Out of the northern desert, someone was riding. For the space of 3 heartbeats, Fraser stood rigid and frozen, squinting through the darkness and tire starshine at that moving shape. Then he turned and ran for the Quonset. He was not allowed to possess a weapon, and if some of the fanatic northern tribesmen had decided to come and cleanse their desert of his defiling presence, there was little he could do but bar the door and pray. He did not go inside just yet. It was unwise to show fear until you had to. He stood by the open door, outside the stream of light that poured from it. He waited, tensed for that final leap. There was only a single rider, mounted on one of the big scaly beasts the Martian nomads use as the earthly desert folk use camels. Fraser relaxed a little, but not too much. One man with a spear could be enough. The stranger came slowly into the light, wrapped and muffled against the night, curbing with a strong hand the uneasy hissings and shyings of the beast at the unfamiliar smells that came to it from the Quonset. Fraser leaned forward, and suddenly the weakness of relief came over him. The rider was a woman, and she carried before her on the saddle pad a child, almost hidden in the folds of her cloak. Fraser gave her the courteous Martian greeting. She looked down at him, tall and fierce-eyed, hating and yet somehow desperate, and presently she said, "You are the Earthman, the doctor." "Yes." The child slept, its head lolled back against the woman's body. There was something unnatural in the way it slept, undisturbed by the light or the voices. Fraser said gently, "I am here only to help." The woman's arm tightened around the child. She looked at Fraser and then in through the open door at the unfamiliar alien things that were there. Her face, made grim and hard by hunger and long marches, and far too proud for weeping, crumbled suddenly toward tears. She lifted the bridle chain and swung the beast around, but before he had gone his own length, she curbed him again. When she had turned once more toward Fraser, she was calm as stone. "My child is ill," she said, very quietly, hesitating over that one word. Fraser held up his arms. "I'll see what I can do." The child, a girl. Fraser saw now, perhaps 7 years old, did not stir even when she was lifted down from the saddle pad. Fraser started to carry her inside, saying over his shoulder to the woman, "I'll need to ask some questions. You can watch while I examine." A wild, harsh cry and a thunder of padded hooves drowned out his words. He whirled around, and then he ran a little way, shouting, with the child in his arms. But it was no use. The woman was bent low in the saddle, urging the beast on with that frantic cry, digging in the spurs, and in a minute she was gone, back into the desert and the night. Fraser stood staring after her, open-mouthed and swearing, and looking helplessly at the girl. There was an ominous finality about the way the woman had left. Why? Even if the child was dying, wouldn't a mother wait to know? Even if the sickness was contagious, would she ride the Lord knew how many miles across the desert with her and then run? There were no answers to those questions. Fraser gave up and went into the Quonset, kicking the door shut behind him. Passing through his combination living quarters and office, he went into the tiny infirmary which adjoined his equally small but well-equipped lab. Neither office nor infirmary had had many customers. The Martians preferred their own methods, their own healers. Fraser was not supposed, anyway, to be the local GP. The Medical Foundation grant and the order of the Martian authorities permitting him to be here both stated that he was engaged in research on certain viruses. Non-cooperation of the populace had not made his work any easier. He became suddenly hopeful about the child. Some 2 hours later, he put her, still sleeping, into the neat white bed and sat down in the room outside where he could watch her through the open door. He had a drink, and then another, and lighted a cigarette with hands that had trouble putting flame and tip together. She was sound as a dollar. Thin, a bit undersized and undernourished like most Martian youngsters, but healthy. There was nothing whatever the matter with her, except that someone had thoroughly drugged her. Fraser rose and flung open the outer door. He went out, staring with a kind of desperation into the north, straining his ears for a sound of hooves. Dawn was not far off. The wind was rising, thickening the lower air with dust, dimming the stars. Out on the desert, nothing moved, nor was there any sound. For the rest of that night and most of the morning that came after it, Fraser sat unmoving by the child's bed, waiting for her to wake. She did it quietly. One moment her face was as it had been, remote and secret, and in the next she had opened her eyes. Her small body stirred and stretched. She yawned, and then she looked at Fraser, very solemnly, but without surprise. He smiled and said, "Hello." She sat up, a dark and shaggy-haired young person with eyes the color of topaz and the customary look of premature age and wisdom that the children of Mars share with the children of the earthly East. She asked hesitantly, "My mother?" "She had to go away for a while," Fraser said, and added with false assurance, "but she'll be back soon." He was comforting himself as much as the child. She took even that shred of hope from him. "No," she said, "she will not come back." She laid her head between her knees and began to cry, not making any fuss about it. Fraser put his arm around her. "Here," he said. "Here now, don't do that. Of course she'll come back for you. She's your mother." "She can't." "But why? Why did she bring you here?" You're not sick. You don't need a doctor. The child said simply, They were going to kill me. Fraser was silent for a long time. Then he said, What? The thin shoulders quivered under his arm. They said I made the sickness that was in our tribe. The old men came all together and they told my father and mother I had to be killed. The old men are very powerful in magic, but they said they could not make me clean. She broke off, choking over a sob. My mother said it was her right to do the thing, and she took me way off into the desert. She cried. Never did that before. I was frightened, and then she told me she wasn't going to hurt me. She was going to take me where I would be safe. She gave me some bitter water to drink and told me not to be afraid. She talked to me until I went to sleep. She looked up at Fraser, a frightened and bewildered little girl, and yet with a dignity about her, too. My mother said our gods have cursed me, and I would never be safe with my own people any more. But she said Earthmen have different gods who wouldn't know me. She said you wouldn't kill me. Is that true? Fraser said something under his breath, and then he told her, Yes, that's true. Your mother is a wise woman. She brought you to the right place. His face had become perfectly white. He stepped back from the bed and asked, What's your name? BISHA. Are you hungry, BISHA? She hesitated, still gulping down sobs. I don't know. You think about it. Your clothes are there. Put them on. I'll fix some breakfast. He went out into the next room, sick and shaking with a rage such as he had never experienced before. Superstition, ignorance, the pious cruelty of the savage. Get an epidemic going, and when the magic of the old man fails, find a scapegoat. Call a child accursed and send its own mother out to slaughter it. Mentally, Fraser bowled to the fierce-eyed woman who had been too tough for those cowardly old men. Poor devil. Only the certainty of death could have made her abandon her child to an Earthman, a creature alien and unknown, but having different gods. Why would they curse me? Asked BISHA, close behind him. Our gods, I mean. Dressing was an easy proposition for her, with one thick garment to pull over her head and sandals for her feet. Her hair hung over her face, and the tears still dripped, and now her nose was running, and Fraser didn't know whether to laugh or cry. They didn't, he said, and picked her up. It's only superstitious nonsense. He stopped. That was not going to do. 7 years, a lifetime of training and belief, were not going to be wiped out by a few words from a stranger. He stood scowling, trying hard to think of a way to reach her, and then he became aware that she was looking at him with a child's intense and wondering stare, sitting quite stiffly in his arms. He asked, Are you afraid of me? I've never seen anyone like you before. And you've never seen a house like this one either. She glanced around and shook her head. No, it's... She had no words for what it was, only a shiver of awe. Fraser smiled. BISHA, you told me the old men of your tribe were very powerful in magic. Oh, yes. He set her down and took her hand firmly in his. I'm going to show you a few things. Come on. He didn't know whether child psychologists and other ethical persons would approve of his method, but it was the only one he could think of. With the imposing air of one performing wonders, he introduced the child of the nomad tents to the miracles of modern gadgetry, from running water to recorded music and microbooks. As a climax, he permitted her to peer in through the door of the laboratory at the mystic and glittering tangle of glass and chrome. And he asked her, Are your old men greater in magic than I? No. She had drawn away from him, her hands clutched tightly around her, as though to avoid the accident of touching anything. Behind her, from the living quarters, Wagner's fire music still roared and rippled out of a tiny spool of wire. Suddenly, BISHA was down on her knees in an attitude of complete submission. "You are the greatest doctor in the world." Her word for doctor meant the same as shaman. Fraser felt contrite and ashamed. It seemed a shabby trick to impress a child, but he stuck to it, saying solemnly, "Very well, BISHA, and now that that is understood, I tell you that curses have no power in this place, and I want no more talk of them." She listened, not raising her head. "You're safe here. You are not to be afraid. Look up at me, BISHA. Do you promise not to be afraid?" She looked up. He smiled, and after a little, she smiled back. "I promise." "Good," he said, and held out his hand. "Let's eat." About then, it dawned on Fraser that he was saddled with a child. For the 4.5 months that remained of his term here, he would have to feed, look after her, and keep her hidden. The people of the town would hardly shelter her. BISHA's mother hadn't trusted them, certainly, and if they did, the nomads would only find her again when they came in for the fall trading. The only other alternative was the central government at Karapa, which would surely not condone ritual murder, but that was 300 miles away. He had a track car, but the work going forward in the lab would not wait for him to trundle a slow 600 miles up and down the desert. He could not possibly leave it. 4.5 months. He looked down at the small figure pattering beside him and wondered what in the devil he was going to do with her all that time. At the end of a week, he would have been lost without her. The awful loneliness and isolation of the Quonset was gone. There was another voice in the place, another presence, somebody to sit across the table from him, somebody to talk to. BISHA was no trouble. She had been brought up not to be a trouble in a hard school where survival was the supreme lesson, and that same school had impressed on her young mind the wisdom of making the best of things. She was no trouble at all. She was company, the first he had had in nearly 9 months. He liked her. Mostly she was cheerful and alert, too much engrossed in a new world of marvels to brood about the past. But she had her moods. Fraser found her one afternoon huddled in a corner, dull and spiritless, in the depths of a depression that seemed almost too deep for tears. He thought he knew what the trouble was. He took her on his lap and said, "Are you lonesome, BISHA?" She whispered, "Yes." He tried to talk to her. It was like talking to a blank wall. At last he said helplessly, "Try not to miss them too much, BISHA. I know I'm not the same as your own family, and this place is strange to you, but try." "You're good," she murmured. "I like you. It isn't that. I was lonesome before, sometimes." "Lonesome for what, BISHA?" "I don't know. Just lonesome." Queer little tyke, thought Fraser. But then most kids are queer to adult eyes, full of emotions so new and untried that they don't know quite how to come out, and no wonder she's depressed. In her spot, who wouldn't be? He put her to bed early, and then, feeling unusually tired after a long day's work, he turned in himself. He was awakened by BISHA, shaking him, sobbing, calling his name. Leaden and half-dazed, he started up in alarm, asking her what was the matter, and she whimpered, "I was afraid. You didn't wake up." "What do you mean I didn't wake up?" He sank back again, weighted down with the sleep he had not finished, and began to bawl her out. Then he happened to look at the clock. He had slept a trifle over 14 hours. Mechanically, he patted BISHA and begged her pardon. He tried to think, and his brain was wrapped in layers of cotton wool, dull, lethargic. He had had one drink before going to bed, not enough to put anyone out for 1 hour, let alone 14. He had not done anything physically exhausting. He had been tired, but nothing the usual 8 hours wouldn't cure. Something was wrong, and a small pinpoint of fear began to prick him. He asked, "How long have you been trying to wake me?" She pointed to a chair that stood beside the window. "When I began, its shadow was there. Now it is there." As near as he could figure, about 2 hours. Not sleep, then. Semi-coma. The pinprick became a knife blade. BISHA said, so low that he could hardly hear her, "It is the sickness that was in our tribe. I have brought it to you." "You might have, at that," Fraser muttered. He had begun to shiver from the onset of simple panic. He was so far away from help. It would be so easy to die here, walled in by the endless miles of desert. The child had withdrawn herself from him. "You see," she said, "the curse has followed me." With an effort, Fraser got hold of himself. "It hasn't anything to do with curses. There are people we call carriers. Listen, BISHA, you've got to help me. This sickness, did any of your tribesmen die of it?" "No." Fraser trembled even more violently, this time from sheer relief. "Well, then, it's not so bad, is it? How does it—" "The old men said they would die unless I was taken away and killed." She had retreated even farther now, to the other side of the room, to the door. Suddenly she turned and ran. It was a minute before Fraser's numbed brain understood. Then he staggered up and followed her out into the dust and the cold light, shouting her name. He saw her, a tiny figure running between the blue-black sky and the dull red desolation, and he ran, too, fighting the weakness and the lassitude that were on him. He seemed to run for hours with the chill wind and the dust, and then he overtook her. She struggled, begging to be let go, and he smacked her. After that, she was quiet. He picked her up, and she wailed, "I don't want you to die." Fraser looked out across the pitiless desert and held her tight. "Do you love me that much, BISHA?" "I have eaten your bread, and your roof has sheltered me." The old ceremonial phrases learned from her elders sounded odd in her young mouth, but perfectly sincere. "You are my family now, my mother and my father. I don't want my curse to fall on you." For a moment, Fraser found it hard to speak. Then he said gently, "BISHA, is your wisdom greater than mine?" She shook her head. "Is it your right to question it?" "No." "What is your right, BISHA, as a child?" "To obey." "You are never to do this again. Never, no matter what happens, are you to run away from me. Do you hear me, BISHA?" She looked up at him. "You're not afraid of the curse, even now?" "Not now, or any other time." "You want me to stay?" "Of course I do, you poor wretched little idiot." She smiled, gravely, with the queer dignity he had seen in her before. "You are a very great doctor," she said. "You will find a way to lift the curse. I'm not afraid now." She lay warm and light in the circle of his arms, and he carried her back to the Quonset, walking slowly, talking all the way. It was odd talk in that time and place. It was about a far-off city called San Francisco and a white house on a cliff that looked out over a great bay of blue water. It was about trees and birds and fishes and green hills and all the things a little girl could do among them and be happy. In the past few minutes, Fraser had forgotten Carapa and the authorities of Mars. In the past few minutes, he had acquired a family. Back in the lab, Fraser began work. He questioned BISHA about the sickness as she had seen it in her tribe. Apparently the seizures came at irregular intervals and involved nothing more than the comatose sleep, but he gathered that the periods of unconsciousness had been much shorter, often no more than a few minutes. That could be accounted for by acquired resistance on the part of the Martians. BISHA, of course, had never had the sickness, and Fraser imagined that the accident of natural immunity had caused her to be picked for the tribal scapegoat. His own symptoms were puzzling. No temperature, no pain, no physical derangement, only the lassitude and weakness, and by next morning they had passed off. He consulted his books on Martian pathology. There was nothing in them. He ran a series of exhaustive tests, even to a spinal tap on BISHA, which she took to be a very potent ritual of exorcism. He would rather have done one on himself, but that was impossible, and there might be evidence in the child of some latent organism. The test was negative. All the tests were negative. He and BISHA both were as healthy as horses. Baffled but intensely relieved, Fraser began to think of other explanations for the ailment. It was not a disease, so it must be a side effect of some physical condition, perhaps the light gravitation, or pressure, or the thin atmosphere, or all three, that affected Martians as well as Earthmen, but in a lesser degree. He made a detailed report, thrusting into the back of his mind as a small worry that no such side effect had ever been observed before. He waited nervously for a recurrence. It didn't come, and as the work in the lab demanded more and more of his attention, he began to forget about it. The time that he woke up in his chair with an untasted drink beside him and no memory of having gone to sleep, he put down resolutely to weariness and overwork. BISHA had retired with another fit of the blues, so she knew nothing about that, and he didn't mention it. She seemed to be getting over the curse fixation, and he wanted to keep it that way. More time went by. BISHA was learning English, and she could name all the trees that stood around the house in San Francisco. The confinement in the small hut was getting them both down, and she was as anxious to leave as Fraser, but apart from that, everything was going well. And then the nomads came in from the desert for the fall trading. Fraser barred the doors and drew the blinds. For the 3 days and nights of the trading, he and BISHA hid inside, with the distant sound of the pipes and the shouting coming to them, muffled but poignant, the music and the voices of BISHA's own people, her own family among the tribes. They were hard days. At the end of them, BISHA retired again into the remoteness of her private grief, and Fraser let her alone. On the 4th morning, the nomads were gone. Fraser thanked whatever gods there were. Weary and dragged out, he went into the lab, hating the work now because it took so much out of him, anxious to have it finished. He started across the room to open the blind. He was lying on the floor. The lights were on, and it was night. BISHA was beside him. She seemed to have been there a long time. His arm ached. There were clumsy wrappings on it, stained with blood. Shards of glass littered the end of the lab bench and the floor. The familiar leaden numbness pervaded his whole body. It was hard to move, hard to think. BISHA crept to him and laid her head on his chest, silently, like a dog. Very slowly, Fraser's head cleared, and thoughts came into it. I must have fallen across the bench. Good God, what if I had broken the virus cultures? Not only us, the whole town. I might have bled to death, and what would happen to BISHA? Suppose I did die, what would happen to her? It took longer this time to return to normal. He stitched up the cuts in his arm, and the job was not neat. He was afraid. He was afraid to leave his chair, afraid to smoke, afraid to operate the stove. The hours crawled by. The rest of the night, another day, another evening. He felt better, but fear had grown into desperation. He had only BISHA's word that this illness was not fatal. He began to distrust his own tests, postulating alien organisms unrecognizable to the medical science he knew. He was afraid for himself. He was terrified for BISHA. He said abruptly, "I'm going into the town." "Then I will come with you." "No, you'll stay right here. I'll be all right. There's a doctor in the town, a Martian healer. He may know." He went out into the bitter darkness and the blazing of the stars. It seemed a long way to the town. He passed the irrigated land, stripped of its harvest, and came into the narrow streets. The town was not old as they go on Mars, but the mud brick of the walls had been patched and patched again, fighting a losing battle with the dry wind and the scouring dust. There were few people abroad. They looked at Fraser and passed him by, swarthy folk, hot-eyed and perpetually desperate. The canal was their god, their mother and their father, their child and their wife. Out of its dark channel they drew life, painfully, drop by drop. They did not remember who had cut it, all the long miles from the polar cap, across the dead sea bottoms, across the deserts, and through the tunnels underneath the hills. They only knew that it was there, and that it was better for a man to sin the foulest sin than to neglect the duty that was on him to keep the channel clear. A cruel life, and yet they lived it, and were content. There were no torches to light the streets, but Fraser knew the house he wanted. The door of corroded metal opened reluctantly to his knock and closed swiftly behind him. The room was small, lit by a smoky lamp and barely warmed by a fire of roots, but on the walls there were tapestries of incalculable age and incredible value. Tor Esh, the man of healing, did well at his trade. His robe was threadbare, but his belly protruded and his chops were plump, unusual things among his lean people. He was fetish priest, oracle, and physician, and he was the only man of the town who had shown any interest in Fraser and his work. It was not necessarily a friendly interest. He gave Fraser the traditional greeting, and Fraser said stiffly, "I need your help. I have contracted an illness." Tor Esh listened. His eyes were shrewd and penetrating, and the smile that was habitually on his face left them untouched. As Fraser talked, even that pretense of a smile went gradually away. When he was finished, Tor Esh said, "Again, more slowly, please. Your Martian is not always clear." "But do you know what it is? Can you tell me?" Tor Esh said, "Again." Fraser repeated the things he had said, trying not to show the fear that was in him. Tor Esh asked questions, accurate questions. Fraser answered them. For a little bit, Tor Esh was silent, heavy-faced, and grim in the flickering light, and Fraser waited with his heart pounding in his throat. Tor Esh said slowly, "You are not ill, but unless a certain thing is done, you will surely die." Fraser spoke in anger. "Talk sense! A healthy man doesn't fall off his feet. A healthy man doesn't die except by accident." "In some ways," said Tor Esh very softly, "we are an ignorant people. It is not because we have not learned. It is because we have forgotten." "I'm sorry, I didn't mean... Look, I came to you for help. This is something I don't understand, something I can't cope with." "Yes." Tor Esh moved to the window, dark in the thickness of the wall. Have you thought of the canal? Not only this one, but the many canals that bind Mars in a great net? Have you thought how they must have been built? The machines, the tremendous power that would have been needed to make a dying world live yet a little longer. We are the children of the men who conceived and built them, and yet nothing is left to us but the end product of their work, and we must grub with our hands in the channel, digging out the blown sand. I know, said Fraser impatiently. I've studied Martian history, but what? Many centuries, said Toresh, as though he had not heard. Nations and empires, wars and pestilences, and kings beyond the counting. Learning, science, growth and splendor, and weariness and decay. Oceans have rolled away into dust, the mountains have fallen down, and the sources of power are used up. Can you conceive, you who come from a young world, how many races have evolved on Mars? He turned to face the Earthmen. You have come with your thundering ships, your machines, and your science, giving the lie to our gods, who we thought had created no other men but us. You look upon us as degraded and without knowledge, and yet you too are an ignorant people, not because you have forgotten, but because you have not yet learned. There are many sciences, many kinds of knowledge. There have been races on Mars who could build the canals. There were others who could see without eyes and hear without ears, who could control the elements and cause men to live or die as they willed it, who were so powerful that they were stamped out because men feared them. They are forgotten now, but their blood is still in us. Destruction of a people is never complete. We few who are left are blended into one race, but their blood is in us, and sometimes a child is born. Fraser stiffened. Toresh said quietly, There was talk among the nomads about a child. Nerves drawing tight in Fraser's belly. Fear nerves and a chill sweat. I never mentioned BISHA. How could he know? I'm not interested in folklore. Just tell me there was a certain evil in the tribe. When the child was taken away, the evil departed. Now it is in your house. It seems that the mother lied. The child is not dead. She is with you. Witchcraft and sorcery, Fraser snarled. Curses and cowardice. I thought you knew better, Toresh. He started for the door. I was a fool to come here. Toresh moved swiftly and placed his hand on the latch, that it might not be lifted until he was through. We are ignorant folk, but still we do not kill children because we find pleasure in it. As for witchcraft and sorcery, words are words. Only facts have meaning. If you wish to die, that is your affair. But when you are dead, the child must come into the town, and that is our affair. I will send word to the nomads. The girl is theirs, and the duty belongs to them. We do not wish it. But until they come, I will set a wall around your house. You are likely to die quite soon. There were 20 in her tribe to share the curse, but you are alone, and we can take no chances. Seeing perhaps the absolute horror in Fraser's face, Toresh added, It will be done mercifully. We bear the child no hatred. He lifted the latch, and Fraser went into the narrow street. He turned toward the desert, and when he had crossed tire-plowed land, he began to run. He ran fast, but a rider passed him, speeding into the desert on the track of the caravan. BISHA was waiting for him, sleepily anxious. He said, "You know where the food is. Pack as much as you can in the track car. Blankets, too. Hurry up. We're leaving." He went into the laboratory. In violent haste, but with the utmost care, he destroyed the work of months, tempted as he did so to forget ethics and scatter his virus cultures broadcast into the town. Evil, superstition, legendary warlocks, tales of mighty wizards. He had read some of the old imaginative stories written before spaceflight, in which ruthless Earthmen were pictured trampling innocent Mars under their feet. Logic and logistics both had made that impossible when it came to the unromantic reality, and he was almost sorry. He would have liked to trample some Martians under his feet. When the laboratory was cleansed, he threw his notes together in a steel box and took them into the dust-tight shed at the back of the Quonset, where the track car was housed. BISHA, tear-streaked and silent, had been patiently lugging supplies. He checked them rapidly, added a few more, and swung the child up into the cab. She looked at him, and he realized then that she was frightened. "Don't worry," he told her. "We're going to be all right." "You're not taking me back?" He said savagely, "I'm taking you to the Terran consulate at Carapa, and after that I'm taking you to San Francisco, and nobody had better try to stop me." He flung open the shed door and climbed in beside her. The track car rolled out, clanking across the sand, and already there were lines of torches streaming out from the town, flung across his way. He said, "Crouch down on the floor, BISHA, and stay there. You won't get hurt." He poured on the power. The track car lurched forward, snorting and raising a great cloud of dust. He headed it straight for the wavering line of torches, ducking his head instinctively so that he was pressed close to the wheel. The cab was metal, and the glass part of it were theoretically unbreakable, but he could see now in the torchlight the bright metal throwing sticks of the townsmen, the swift boomerangs that could take off a man's head as neatly as a knife blade. He ducked. Something hit the window beside him, starring it with a million cracks. Other things whacked and rattled viciously against the car. The torches fell away from in front of him, taking with them the dark, startled faces of the men who held them. He was through the line. The open desert was before him. 300 miles, Carapa, and civilization. If he could beat the nomads. He had better beat them. It was his neck as well as BISHA's. He needed care. He needed it fast from somebody who did not believe in curses. Dawn came, cold in a dark sky, veiled in dust. There was no canal between them and Carapa, no town, nothing but the fine, dry sand that flowed like water under the wind. "Look here," he said to BISHA. "If I should suddenly fall asleep—" He showed her how to stop the track car. "At once, BISHA, and stay inside the cab until I wake again." She nodded, her lips pressed tight with the effort of concentration. He made her do it several times until he was sure she would not forget. The miles flowed out before and behind, to left and to right, featureless, unbroken. How long would it take a single rider to catch a laden caravan? How long for the desert men on their fleet beasts to find a trail? The sand was soft and the clanking treads sank in it, and no matter how much you wanted to hurry, you could go no faster than the desert would let you. BISHA had been thinking hard. Suddenly she said, "They will follow us." She was smart, too smart for her own good. Fraser said, "The nomads? We can beat them. Anyway, they'll soon give up." "No, they'll follow." Not you, but me, and they will kill us both. Fraser said, We're going to Earth. The men of Mars and the gods of Mars can't reach there. They are very powerful gods. Are you sure? Very sure. You'll be happy on Earth, BISHA. She sat close to him, and after a while she slept. There was a compass on the dash, a necessity in that place of no roads and no landmarks. Fraser kept the needle centered, setting a course as though with a ship. Time and the sand rolled on, and he was tired. Tired. You are likely to die quite soon. There were 20 in her tribe to share the curse. The desert whispered. The sounds of the track car were accepted and forgotten by the ear, and beyond them the desert whispered, gliding, sliding, rippling under the wind. Fraser's vision blurred and wavered. He should not have pushed himself so hard at the work. Tired, no resistance to the sickness. That was why it had been light among the hardy nomads, more serious in him, an alien already worn down by months of confinement and mental strain. That was why. 20 in her tribe to share it, but you alone. 300 miles isn't so far. Of course you can make it. You've made it in an afternoon on Earth. This isn't Earth, and you didn't make it in a cold, creeping desert. You alone. Damn Tor Esh. BISHA, wake up. We need some food. And first off, I need that bottle. With a drink and some food inside him, he felt better. We'll keep on all night. By morning, Easy will be in Karapa. If the nomads are following, they'll never catch up. Mid-afternoon, and he was driving in a daze. He lost track of the compass. When he noticed it again, he was miles off his course. He sat for some minutes trying to remember the correct reading, trembling. BISHA watched him. Don't look so frightened, he said. His voice rose. I'm all right. I'll get us there. She hung her head and looked away from him. And don't cry, damn it. Do you hear? I've got enough on my neck without you being doleful. It is because of me, she said. You should have believed the words of the old men. He struck her, the first time he had ever laid his hand on her in anger. I don't want any more of that talk. If you haven't learned better in all this time. She retreated to the other side of the seat. He got the track car going again, in the right direction, but he did not go far. He had to rest. Just an hour's sleep would help. He stopped. He looked at BISHA, and like something that had happened years ago, he remembered that he had slapped her. Poor little BISHA, he said, and it isn't any of it your fault. Will you forgive me? She nodded, and he kissed her, and she cried a little, and then he went to sleep, telling her to wake him when the hand on the dashboard clock reached 5. It was hard to rouse when the time came, and it was full dark before the track car was lurching and bucking its way out of the sand that had drifted around it. Fraser was not refreshed. He felt worse, if anything, sapped and drained, his brain as empty as an upturned bucket. He drove. He was off his course again. He must have dozed, and the car had made a circle to the south. He turned angrily to BISHA and said, Why didn't you stop the car? I told you. In the faint glow from the dashboard, he saw her face, turned toward the desert, and he knew the look on it, the withdrawal and the sadness. She did not answer. Fraser swore. Of all the times to pick for a fit of the blues when he needed her so badly, she had enough to make her moody, but it was getting to be a habit, and she had no right to indulge her emotions now. She had already cost them precious hours, precious miles. He reached out and shook her. It was like shaking a rag doll. He spoke to her sharply. She seemed not to hear. Finally, he stopped the car, furious with her stubbornness, and wrenched her around to face him. For the second time, he slapped her. She did not weep. She only whispered, "I can't help it. They used to punish me too, but I can't help it." She didn't seem to care. He couldn't touch her, couldn't penetrate. He had never tried to shake her out of these moods before. Now he found that he could not. He let her sink back into the corner, and he looked at her, and a slow, corrosive terror began to creep through him because of the times before, the times that she had been like this, the times immediately preceding the periods of blackness, the abnormal sleep. A pattern. Every time, the same unvaried pattern. But it made no sense. It was only coincidence. Coincidence? 3 times repeated? And how had Tor Esh known so certainly that the child was with him? 3 times the pattern. If it happened a 4th time, it could not be coincidence. If it happened a 4th time, he would know. Could he afford a 4th time? Crazy. How could a child's moods affect a man? He grabbed her again. A desperation came over him. He treated her roughly, more roughly than he could ever have dreamed of treating a child. And it did no good. She looked at him with remote eyes and bore it without protest, without interest. Not a mood, then. Something else. What? Sometimes a child is born. Fraser sent the track car rushing forward along the beam from its headlights, a bright gash in the immemorial dark. He was afraid. He was afraid of BISHA, and still he would not believe. Get to Karapa. There's help there. Whatever it is, there'll be somebody to know the truth, to do something. Keep awake. Don't let the curtain fall again. Think. We know it isn't a curse. That's out. We know it isn't a disease. We know it isn't side effects. They'd have been observed. Besides, Tor Esh understood. What was it he had said about old races? What did they teach us about them in colleges? Too much and not enough. Too many races and not enough time. They could see without eyes, and he, without ears. They could control the elements. He tried to remember, and it was a pain and a torment. He looked at the child. Old races, recessive genes, still cropping out. But what's the answer? ESP is known among the Martians, but this isn't ESP. What then? A remnant, a scrap of something twisted out of shape and incomplete? What is she so lonesome for that she doesn't know? The answer came to him suddenly, clear as the ringing of a bell. A page from a forgotten textbook, hoarded all these years in his subconscious, a casual mention of a people who had tried to sublimate the conditions of a dying world by establishing a kind of mental symbiosis, living in a tight community, sharing each other's minds and their potentials, and who had succeeded in acquiring by their mass effort such powers of mental control that for several centuries they had ruled this whole quadrant of Mars, leaving behind them a host of legends, and a child. A child normal and healthy in every way but one. Her brain was incomplete, designed by a cruel trick of heredity to be one of a community of interdependent minds that no longer existed. Like a battery, it discharged its electrical energy in the normal process of thinking and living, and like a run-down battery, it must be charged again from outside, because its own regenerative faculty was lacking. And so it stole from the unsuspecting minds around it, an innocent vampire draining them whenever it felt the need. It was draining his now. There'd been 20 in her tribe, and so none of them had died as yet, but he was alone, and that was why the intervals had shortened, because he could no longer satisfy her need. And the Martians, in their ignorance, were right, and he in his wisdom had been wrong. If he put her out now and left her in the desert, he would be safe. He stopped the car and looked at her. She was so little and helpless, and he had come to love her. It wasn't her fault. Something might still be done for her. A way might be found. And in a city, she would not be so deadly. Could he survive another plunge into the darkness? He didn't know, but she had run away once of her own accord, for his sake. He could do no less than try. He took her into his arms. The curtain dropped. Fraser woke slowly in brazen sunshine and a great silence. As one creeping back from the edge of an abyss, he woke, and the car was very still. There was no one in it with him. He called, but there was no answer. He got out of the car. He walked, calling, and then he saw the tracks of the nomad's beasts coming toward the car from behind, the small tracks of BISHA's feet going back to meet them. He stopped calling. The sound of his voice was too loud, too terrible. He began to run back along that trail. It ended in a little huddle of clothing that had no life in it. She had broken her promise to him. She had disobeyed and left him, asleep and safe, to meet the riders by herself, the riders who were following her, not him. So small a grave did not take long to dig. Fraser drove on. There was no more danger now, but he drove fast, seeing the desert in a blur, wanting never to see it again, wanting only earth, but not a white house there that for him would be forever haunted. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.